So tonight we have a very interesting speaker, an associate professor, chair of rhetoric, film, and screen studies at Bates College, named Stephanie Kelley-Romano. And in particular, she does a lot of work around presidential campaign rhetoric. And oh, isn't that timely? But she has other research interests. She's rather omnivorous, it looks like, including gender and media, myth and narrative, conspiracy, political rhetoric, and the public sphere. And she's had publications in Newsweek and the Journal of Hate Studies. I did not know there was that journal, and a number of other journals, including the Journal of UFO Studies, because she interviews people who think they've been abducted by aliens and is often sought out for podcasts on the paranormal and the extraterrestrial. So, wow, I think we need to get her back to talk about that later. But for right now, we're talking about presidential rhetoric. And Stephanie, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Hey, everyone. I'm going to actually share my screen in a minute so that you can see some slides that I've made. And what I thought we would do tonight, I was really given free license. And I'm excited to talk to you because oftentimes when I lecture, obviously I talk to 18 to 20-year-olds, and 18 to 20-year-olds are wonderful. I absolutely love them, particularly the energy and the enthusiasm, but oftentimes they lack a depth of experience, obviously. So it's really nice to be able to talk to different constituencies. So tonight what I'm going to talk about is navigating the noise, how to fight fake news and conspiracy theories. So you all can see these slides, yes? Yes. Yep. All right. Someone is nodding. Thank you. I'm going to try to make this. Zoom is the weirdest thing ever. Okay. So now I can see some of you, which is good. So I can see reactions if I start veering off the road here. All right. So, like Lisa said, I teach at Bates. I've been at Bates since 1999, and I did start in my dissertation was about people who think that they've been abducted by aliens. And it seems a little random and irrelevant, but it actually isn't, because my passion is, how do people come to believe things? Why do people believe different things? How can someone wake up and think they've been abducted by aliens? Or how can someone wake up and think they've been saved by Jesus Christ? Or how can someone think that Hillary Clinton is running a sex ring out of a pizza parlor in New York? I want to know, like, how do these beliefs happen? And so I got my PhD from the University of Kansas, and then came to Bates. I never expected all of my areas of interest to coalesce in this kind of political moment that we're in now, but that's kind of exactly what's happened. So there we go. So first, of course, I have to tell you just really quickly what rhetoric is, because a lot of times we have a very pejorative definition of rhetoric where we think it's mere rhetoric or it's just BS. And I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. And Aristotle, despite, he's problematic for several reasons, but his definition of rhetoric is the faculty of discerning in any case all the available means of persuasion, right? And the important thing about this is that Aristotle defines rhetoric as a faculty, right? It's an ability of discernment. And so obviously rhetoric is essential to the public sphere and to the healthy functioning of the state. And so being able to understand what persuades when, how, and why is important. And to hopefully do it responsibly, that's another lecture. So for today, I wanted to start with, like, what is going on? Like, what is going on? I was going to write obscenities on this slide, but I didn't know you all well enough. And so I just went with the what is going on. First of all, And it's not, first of all. But in 2005, Stephen Colbert talked about, and he coined the term truthiness, right? And he was talking about those things that have a feel of truth, right? And this whole notion that we listen to our gut, and suddenly our gut becomes really important. And in 2006, it was Merriam-Webster's dictionary, their word of the year. 10 years later, in 2016, suddenly the word of the year is post-truth, right? And we are now living in this era of like fake news and conspiracy is what some people will say. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. But there are a confluence of other things that are happening that go on that have helped to contribute to the current political and media climate mainly. I'm talking about the media. And the first is the fairness doctrine, which was basically a thing that said there had to be fair and balanced, or at least equal coverage within news broadcasting. And that was in 1987 repealed, ironically, because of the damage they thought that it would do, the chilling effect to free speech. I'm not sure that we don't want to think about revisiting that, but it was repealed in 1987. And so then what we see from then on is we see an increase in editorializing, we see an increase in bias, and we just see a general increase in the emotional quotient within news. Additionally, we have the 24-hour news cycle. So suddenly we have this voracious, needing to be filled cycle, and we need to put things in there. And I would argue that in 2016, one of the things that went on, because we had this news cycle going on during the election, Donald Trump got all kinds of coverage of various appearances and things that he was doing, not because they were necessarily newsworthy, but because he was a celebrity and people needed to fill airtime, right? And based on some of the things I'm going to tell you later, we're going to see why that was not a good idea. And finally, we have social media, and social media is just, social media is something. Social media is easily manipulated in the sense that if I have the right computer program, I can make something go viral, right? I can get a message out there. And social media and its ability to influence and the ease with which we can, click on information and pass it on is also contributing to almost the frenzy of information that we experience now. So I study conspiracy theory, and I also study fake news. And the first thing I wanted to go briefly over is like, why do we believe these things? Like, how does this happen? And first of all, we are pattern-seeking animals, right? We're pattern-seeking and also narrative animals. We like stories and we like things to make sense. And this is why we see faces on the moon, why we see canals on Mars, why we see unicorns in the clouds. We see patterns and we look for them. There's also this thing called the Mandela effect. I don't know if any of y'all have heard about this, but basically what it was that there were a bunch of people who thought that Nelson Mandela had died while in prison when he hadn't, right? But many, many people believed it. And there are lots of examples of the Mandela effect. So for example, the famous line, "Luke, I am your father," never happened in Star Wars, right? Darth Vader never actually says that. The one that always blows my mind is in Silence of the Lambs, when Hannibal Lecter says, what does he say? Hello, Clarice, right? He actually doesn't say that. What he says is good morning. Yet somehow pop culture and our collective memory has managed to be incredibly manipulated a lot. So times of uncertainty are also times when people are more likely to believe conspiracy theories and potentially grab onto fake news, right? So during times of uncertainty, people oftentimes are looking for a sense of agency. And I would argue that particularly in the time of COVID, when we have been remanded to our homes, and literally all we have is the internet with which to seek out information, of course, people are desperate to know, what is this? Where did it come from? How did it happen? Is it going to get worse? What can prevent it? People are searching for answers and looking for it. And so conspiracy scholars have noted that during times of uncertainty, indeed, adherence to conspiracy does rise somewhat. And like I kind of already talked about, there are identity functions around this in terms of we want to know things and we want to feel as though we know, but it also gives us a community. So when you believe a certain thing, if you believe in Pizzagate, or if you believe the moon landing was faked, or if you believe that the earth is flat, you have a community to which you can belong, to which you and they have this special information that other people can't quite see, which, you know, would make you feel special, which would make you feel in the know, kind of thing. And finally, there is a human predisposition for conspiracy. In a recent book by Joe Uzinski and Joseph Parent, they found that instead of times of conspiracy rising and falling very dramatically, which is, I think, at least what I thought, right? I thought that there were times when conspiracies really grabbed onto people. Instead of that, what we find is that conspiracy is a pretty consistent thing across time. And most people believe at least one conspiracy. Some social scientific research, however, has shown that some people are more predisposed to believe in conspiracies than others. I don't know that we can necessarily identify those people easily, but they exist. So what I teach when I teach at Bates is I teach basic media literacy, and I'm going to go over some of the basic media literacy stuff, and then just a couple suggestions on how to deal with your aunt, cousin, uncle, husband at dinner, right? If they politically disagree with you. First of all, in order to have some media literacy and to promote a healthy public sphere, right? Because I believe, I hope, that most people don't necessarily want to be right. They want to do what's best. And we have to believe that if more people contribute to a conversation, that's going to enhance the conversation. But we get our egos in there, and then suddenly people are defensive. People hold on to their beliefs so tightly and are so reluctant to admit that they're wrong, to change their mind, or to evolve, that we just hold on to it. So I argue that what we need to do is start by assuming this orientation of vigilance. And what that means is whenever we consume any type of media, I have to steel myself for it, right? Like I have to be in a very particular place because of several things I'll talk about in a minute. But we think about the fact that all messages are constructed. Everything is made. Everything is made by people. And all these people have agendas, right? Messages always have embedded values and points of view, which are reflected through language. I remember Hurricane Katrina. And after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of media scholars have written about the fact that sometimes there were photographs of white people who were called survivors. And then there were photos of African American or people of color, and those people were looters. So how we label things and what we call them obviously has an important impact. Whether or not we call someone a survivor versus a victim is hugely significant in consent culture. And additionally, when we assume our orientation of vigilance, we need to think about the fact that media is not doing this to be nice, right? Like the New York Times is not all about, hey, let's make the world a better place. Maybe, hopefully, some of the people there are, but primarily, or at least a lot, I'm trying not to be super cynical, it's about power and it's about profit. And so whenever I consume media, I have to think about who gets power from this. In this particular narrative characterization of the situation, who is getting power and who is disempowered, particularly with conspiracy theories. So when you engage news, what I would highly recommend and hope for, and what I do, is I first of all try to be aware of what I'm feeling, right? If I feel any kind of way after reading something, that's usually a cue to me that this might not be the most objective, the most newsy kind of piece of work. I also suggest that people read horizontally. And what I mean by that is whenever, and especially when I see something on Facebook that is somewhat incendiary or makes me freak out, which happens a lot since 2016, my alerts that come to my phone are disturbing. So when I see something on my phone and I'm like, is that really real? And I realize that, okay, it's not The Onion, what I do is I read horizontally, which means I Google it, right? And so first you Google it, and your first couple Google hits are always going to be ads. So you need to be aware of that, because those are paid content that people can buy deliberately to show up higher on the Google feed. So when we read, I have to look down the page a little and read and see who wrote it. What is the organization? What are their credentials? Who is the author? What are the author's credentials? What happens if I Google the author? All of these types of things. And so when I get a story, particularly during the Mueller investigations, I was super reading horizontally, because I would want to check. I would want to fact check different things that were in there. And so I would literally Google, did this happen? And all types of different reports would come up. And then you can cull through those. Also, we should obviously always seek out a variety of sources, not only so that we are well informed, but I do it, I'm not going to lie, super strategically, so that I know not the enemy, but I know the opposition. I need to know exactly what are the arguments that are being made against those things that I find important or valuable. And then I can think back to Aristotle, what are the most effective ways, what are the most effective means of persuasion to dissuade from those particular things? The site All Sides, I put a note here, allsides.com, they are a really great news source, because what they do is they collect sources from multiple sites. They have a left-leaning, a right-leaning, and a kind of moderate source on most topics and or events. And so to be able to read the spectrum is good. Also, to read internationally is oftentimes helpful and unfortunately depressing. As I said before, you need to evaluate the source, which includes the news organization and the author, and also evaluate the content. And when we evaluate content, particularly of web pages and whatnot, we need to think about the grammar. Like if I'm reading something that claims to be breaking news and there are grammatical or spelling errors, that's oftentimes an indication that maybe this isn't super reputable. Also the aesthetics. If I'm getting a ton of ads, I'm suspect, because you know what? Most mainstream news organizations don't have to have a ton of ads. And if the ads match the content or complement the content of the article, that's another good cue. So I do a lot, I go on Breitbart a lot. I do a lot with preppers and with kind of a lot of apocalyptic stuff. And oftentimes when I'm reading those news pieces, what comes up in the sidebar for ads are things about meals ready to eat, and bunkers that I can buy, and backpacks, a bug out backpack that you can get for only $59.99. Okay, so how do we deal with the individual people, right? Because this is when the frustration happens, and this is my mother and this is my sister, so I understand this firsthand. And it's oftentimes difficult, and it's difficult because one of the things is this boomerang effect. And what the boomerang effect tells us is that when we try to offer disconfirming information, right, when we try to correct things, what it actually does is it reinforces the belief. So what that means is, while our natural propensity might be like, dude, look at this fact sheet, right? We can't do that, because evidently that does not work. And the thing is that I have to keep in mind, that doesn't work on me. And so as on the other side of that equation, I too need to kind of open myself up to having my beliefs challenged. So for example, with the boomerang effect, there was this study that was done about UFO people and people who believed in UFOs. And when they read an article that had a physicist or some big scientist talking about the fact that UFOs did not exist in terms of extraterrestrially driven craft, they actually were more likely to believe in UFOs, right? The mere presence of an opposition gives the whole issue more credibility, right? Which was obviously what happened in 2016. Donald Trump, through the celebrity door, kept getting coverage, and suddenly he was viable. So we have to be careful of the boomerang effect. Also, there's the backfire effect. They like to make pithy little things like this. And basically, the backfire effect says that what we need to do is not name the problem, especially when it comes to conspiracy. And this is interesting because I do a lot of work with the anti-vaccination movement as well. And what they found was they had a brochure that had the facts and myths about vaccines. And it listed all of the myths about it causing autism or whatever. And it listed all of the facts about the fact that people who get it are less likely to get the flu. They get it for shorter amounts of time. They're healthier. So when people read this brochure, they were very clear and they very much could re-articulate exactly what the differences were between the facts and the myths. However, 30 minutes later, many people reported that the myths were fact. Their ability to keep things on the right side of truth, if you will, was brutally blurred. And so it's very important that, like, I know when I'm talking about anti-vaccination, I don't talk about causing autism. I don't bring up the thing that could plant the seed. So obviously when we're talking to Uncle Jake or Aunt Flo at the dinner table on Thanksgiving, we have to try to find a way to meet on common ground. And I know these things seem like brutally simplistic, civil, human things. But I know for me, I sometimes forget it. And so it's good for me to tell you all, and it's good for us all to remember, because I can think about with my mother, you know, we have my children, her grandchildren in common. We have a love for nature in common. And so I really try to start from there. And then I try to have, I'm going to give you both, because you try to have specific facts and examples. And so one time when I was trying to convince my mother not to vote for Trump, I was talking about kind of his policy environmentally and things like this. And I had specific examples, things that had happened in his corporation and with his companies that were kind of anti-environment. And it's best to be gentle, go gently into that good night, because this is a long haul. And we're not going to be able to steer the ship or turn the ship entirely around. Additionally, and rhetorically, asking questions and telling stories is hugely altering to people's attitudes. So if you can either ask people questions like, you know, have you ever been assaulted by a person of color, right? Or something like that, oftentimes will startle them and maybe they'll think a little bit differently. Or tell stories about things and why it's important to you. It seems to change people's mind, even when the stories seem unrelated. And obviously, I've kind of already touched on this, kind of acknowledge the limitation of our own knowledge and co-create meaning with the other person, right? So I will say, I don't know everything about X, Y, or Z, say the moon landing, but I do know that the moon landing pictures were taken from a camera that was outside, that was mounted on the outside of the ship, which is how they were able to take those photos, right? Because one of the arguments is that there was no one there to hold the camera. So clearly it happened on a sound stage. And so to offer just one piece of information can really be the wedge that gets in there and gets someone to be thinking. These were just some resources. I know I went through that really quick, but we want to have time for questions. These were just some resources in terms of reading news and checking news. Factcheck.org, Snopes.com, Polyfact.com are all good places to see whether or not something is true, because it's really hard to wade through it these days. And I'll tell you about this real quick too. I put this slide up because I didn't know if you all had seen it. This slide is one that oftentimes people have seen, and oftentimes people think that it's a good thing. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but the scientific methodology that went into making it is certainly in question. The data sets that the woman who made this, she's unwilling to share her data sets or her methodologies, and so it's a little suspect. I do think that it is a very good indication of how people feel about particular media, about where they feel like it sits on the spectrum, but whether or not this is an accurate representation of the actual conservative versus liberal leaning is really something that needs to be further tested. So I just kind of wanted to throw that one out there.
Well, this was fast. This was fun. Oh my God. I mean, who thought political rhetoric was fun?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I don't know. We may have you back for some later observations closer to the election, because it's going to get hot and heavy.
Yeah, we should stay in touch because we are at Bates. Like Josh mentioned, they do this whole big mock campaign, but we also do voter registration, voter information campaigns, and we do a series of debate watches. And I think in all likelihood, some of the debate watches are going to be virtual. And so you all could Zoom in and watch the debates with us. It's so fun. But I'm a nerd. I love it.
Well, Zoom has definitely opened up, we were talking about that too, a level of convenience for dropping into these kinds of events where you don't have to drive 45 minutes or an hour and a half to get there. So,
Yep.
Which would have been a schlep for you, Stephanie. So thank you so much for Zooming with us. We really appreciate it. And all right, we're done. Check in with your email about what's happening, because things are beginning to percolate a little. And hopefully we'll see you next month with another exciting monthly meeting.